All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah Levin. I'm the program coordinator for Jews for a Secular Democracy. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are an initiative of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. It is a initiative that is pluralistic and working to galvanize the Jewish community to advocate for separation of church and state. And today we're really excited to host Dr. Sabrina Dent, who I'll tell you about in a second, and I'll turn it over to her in a minute. But if you are interested in getting involved in Jews for a Secular Democracy, you can go to our website, jfasd.org, and sign up to volunteer as well as donate to support our work. And I'll drop those links in the chat later as well. After Dr. Dent speaks, as Paul just mentioned a few minutes ago, we will be doing a Q&A. There's two ways to do that. You can put it in the chat or in the Q&A function. We recommend the Q&A, but we'll be checking both. So please do submit those questions. And without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. So Dr. Sabrina Dent, she is the senior faith advisor at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Before joining the Americans United team, Sabrina worked as director of recruitment and admissions at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum, where she managed several of the education initiatives designed for religious and civic leaders. Prior to her time at the Religious Freedom Center, Dr. Dent served as program coordinator for the Doctor of Ministry program at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. And she's also the past president of the Interfaith Community of Greater Richmond. She has a much longer bio than that, but I'm sure you want to hear from her directly. And she's going to be speaking to us today about how we can understand the relationship between racial justice and church-state separation work. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Dent. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I also want to say good afternoon to everyone, and thank you to Paul for Jews for a Secular Democracy for this opportunity to share with you today, to really share some of my thoughts on the topic, how racial justice relates to church-state separation and the role that you can play moving forward as an ally, or you will eventually hear me say an accomplice in this work. And so with that, I'm going to start to share my screen with you so you can see from which we'll be speaking today. Just give me 1 second here. All right, here we go. So as I said, we will be speaking from the topic, how racial justice relates to church-state separation. And so I'm going to start with this image here and this quote. In her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Angela Davis wrote, "Racism is so dangerous because it does not necessarily depend on individual actors, but is deeply embedded in the apparatus. It is not easy to eradicate racism so deeply entrenched in the structures of society. And this is why it's important for us to develop an analysis that goes beyond understanding individual acts of racism." So I start this conversation realizing that it doesn't escape me that in 1892, on March 9th, 1892, that three friends of Ida B. Wells, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee, which started the beginning of her crusade, her anti-lynching crusade. And so I'm inspired by her words and empowered by her words, where she said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." So in the next few minutes, I hope to do that with you as we embark on this journey together in discussing racial justice. At the same time, it's not remiss that just a few minutes ago, I heard from Congressman James Clyburn and Representative Richard Blumenthal, who spoke about the importance of gun reform based on the experiences of racial and religious minorities in this country. And so, again, I want to shed some light and perspectives from my own experience and those of my community. So let's talk about church state separation and the slave Bible. So, my connection with church state separation is very complicated. The church and the state have always or never ceased to separate themselves when it came to the existence of people of the African diaspora. Specifically for my family, we cherish the date of April 4th, 1865, because that is the day in which my great grandfather, Napoleon Dent, was emancipated from slavery. And it would be many years later that my great grandfather would establish a church in Reduco, North Carolina, which gave not only a place of worship, but a safe haven for the community. And this has been the experiences of many Black people, whether they're religious or non-religious, is that they've had to find safe places in which they could exist and which they could be. And so I'm showing you this slide here about the slave Bible because I think it's very critical to understand that everyone's narrative about church state separation is different, depending on your context, your racial background, your cultural background, your experience. You might have a different narrative to this. So as you can see from the slide, that the slave Bible was published in 1807 in London. And I find it very interesting that this was published just years after the Haitian Revolution, which, if you know anything about the Haitian Revolution, this is when the people of Haiti then fought for their liberation. And so, what does it mean for this sacred text to be established to then be used for those that were enslaved to to be obedient to their masters, and also to follow a tradition that they themselves might not have ascribed to. And as you can see from the data that I have on the slide, that 90% of the text from the Old Testament was missing, 50% was missing, and there were only certain passages that were used in the slave Bible to confirm slavery. And one of which I want to raise is one that can be found in, and I think this is significant even for this audience to hear, was in Titus 2:9, where it reads, "Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they could be fully trusted. So in every way, make the teaching about God of our Savior attractive." There's nothing attractive about a text being used to dehumanize a group of people. And so I raise this because there might be perceptions by some individuals that because people of color, African Americans, have had a complex history with race and religion and continue to in society today, that we might not have concerns about church state separation, but that I will challenge you and say that is not true. So I want to share this slide with you because I want you to think about what are your influences or what influences your opinion about church state separation. Is it the education that you've received? Is it about social media posts that you've seen? Has it been your family? Has it been your religious or civic leaders that you've engaged? Or has it been about elected officials? Who are the people, as Dr. Walter Fluker says, who are the people in the plot of your narrative live that have shaped your life or shaped certain perceptions that you have about church-state separation? Is it organizations that you have engaged? There are many different influences that we have in our lives. And so when we're talking about this topic, whether we're looking at it through the lens of racial justice or whether we're looking at church-state separation, we have to remember who the influences are in our lives and what have been our personal and lived experiences that have brought us to this point of doing the work that we do. So I want to raise this, that many of you may be aware of this, that the religious landscape in America is changing. We know that now white Christians account for less than half of the public, and there is a decline in the number of white evangelical Protestants as well as white Catholics. There is a growing number of individuals that identify as religious nuns that are unaffiliated, or even those that identify as agnostics or atheists, or along the spectrum of secular or non-religious individuals. So the numbers are changing. And PRI did this, the Public Religion Research Institute did this, atlas or this study in 2016 to really look at the religious landscape in America to see how it is evolving. And what I find is, I think it's very troubling for some people that identify in the groups that I mentioned earlier on, that they are witnessing that the landscape is changing. And so what does this mean for their identity here in America? Again, this infographic shows more of the dynamics or the demographics of how the landscape is changing here in the United States. As you can see, there are a larger number of people that identify as unaffiliated. I myself would fall within that category because although I come from a Pentecostal background, I was licensed as a Baptist minister, that I've had many life experiences and engagements with many other religious communities, whereas now I simply identify as a spiritual person that affirms the human dignity and value of every person. But I think it's important for us to see this infographic to see that there is so much diversity that's within the religious landscape here in the United States. And so we have to talk about racial justice when we're talking about religious freedom in this country. To that point, I want to show you this Pew Research infographic that shows that there is religious diversity even among Black Americans. As you can see, there are those that identify as Buddhists, although historically most are known as Black Protestants. But you see the diversity that exists within the religious diversity that exists within the Black community, and even some that may not even be named on this slide here. And so it's important for me to call that out as someone that advocates for the religious freedom and rights of every person and their human dignity. And so I enter into this conversation asking people to be mindful of the fact that not every Black person is religious, not every Black person is Christian, but we are also across the spectrum of religious identities and worldviews here in the United States and abroad. But going back to the question of what shapes your opinion about church-state separation, I want to know what is your opinion about, what shapes your opinion about this image that you see? This is an image from December 12th of 2020 when the Proud Boys were burning the Black Lives Matter sign from a historic Black church, Asbury United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. They also targeted Metropolitan AME Church. So I look at this image and I wonder, what does this say about the existence, the human dignity, and the rights of Black people in America, for people of color in America, for Black people who may be also religious in America? What does it say about their identity and their existence? And then I look at this image here, of course, from the insurrection that took place on January 6th of this year at the US Capitol. And so I look at this image and I see a display of Christian nationalism. I see a display of white supremacy. I see so many violations in terms of the fact that we know they were not supposed to be on the Capitol stairs. And not to mention the many different layers of issues that come up when I see this image. I wondered, what did this look like for racial and religious minorities in this country? What did this look like for non-religious individuals in this country to see this type of imagery? And so again, I approached this conversation thinking about how, in many ways, there are much complexities when we're talking about church state separation, as well as religious freedom when it pertains to racial and religious minorities in this country. But there are those of us that are doing the work to help change the narrative. And so I want to share more with you. But we need to look at what is racism. So Merriam-Webster says that racism is basically a belief that a race is a fundamental detriment of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. As you can see, it's not just about a belief, but it's also about one's behavior and attitudes towards a certain group that then allows for them to act out in the ways in which they do. So for me, this is racism at a glance. I've been to both of these places that are highlighted in this slide here. And so in 2019, I went to the South African Jewish Holocaust Museum in Cape Town. And this was one of the images that stood out to me because I went not only to the museum, but I went with my child. And so here you have an image of Jewish women who are with their children, who refuse to be separated from their children, who were then sent to the gas chambers because they refused to separate themselves from the child. At the same time, then you have the image that is before you from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama. And here you see where the columns that are on the screen there are representative of people from different counties and different states around the United States in which lynchings took place in this country. And so each column represents a person or people. And so for me, this is racism at a glance when you tie in not only one's racial identity, but one's culture as well as one's religious identity. So what is systemic racism? Systemic racism is basically, according to Merriam-Webster, it is the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another group. It is a political or social system that is founded on racism, which means it's based on one's identities and the traits of that individual or that group, that is designed to execute certain principles. And so what does that look like? Because we're talking about racial justice, right? I want to share this with you. So I often highlight this slide here, which are facts to consider. So here are some facts that I want you to consider in this conversation, is that we have to remember that the founding framers of the Constitution were very strong advocates for religious freedom, which we celebrate that freedom today in many ways, although I recognize that there are many people across the world and even within this country that do not have the full extent of religious freedom. In some countries, people are persecuted, and that comes even in the form of death. So I celebrate that, but yet we have to remember that the founding framers of the Constitution also enslaved people. So they weren't allowing for human freedom to exist for certain groups. So if they didn't have human freedom, that means they didn't have religious freedom, because that was only extended to human beings. At the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that the Naturalization Act of 1790 defined that what it meant to be a citizen, the legal definition of what it meant to be a citizen, was that you were white, you owned property, and that you had the right to vote. That excluded women, that excluded indigenous people, that excluded Black people. We have to also remember that although President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, that we should not forget that some didn't realize that they were, or some weren't even emancipated until 1865. But that was just the emancipation from slavery. That did not give them voting rights, which were a part of the definition of what it meant to be white in America, according to the Naturalization Act. And then we have to also look at the case of Mr. Najur in 1909, where the United States determined that Asiatic Turks could be considered white in America. But I find it very interesting that in 1922, the case of this Japanese man that's pictured here is Takawa Ozawa, who who was seeking citizenship in the United States, was declined the opportunity to become an American citizen. And although he fit the legal definition of what it meant to be white in America, it was stated by one of the justices that what it means to be white in America is determined by the common person. But there was a legal definition of it. And then we have to remember the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65. That's when African Americans really fought harder to even gain the right to vote. And keep in mind, in between, although there were efforts for that to happen, that there was the Reconstruction era, and we know that there were polling taxes, and we know that voter suppression still exists today. So this does tie into church-state issues as well as religious freedom, and I'll continue to point you to that. So we have to remember again, and looking at this slide, from slavery to religious freedom. And I want to preface this slide by saying that the narratives of African people of the diaspora, we do not start with slavery, right? Our existence preceded slavery. We were in thriving communities before we were separated from our families. But I wanted to show you this image of the Door of No Return in the Elmina Castle in Ghana, because when this event took place, it was not just the separation of families, the separation of communities, it was the stripping of identities. And so it raises the question, religious freedom for whom in America and for whom around the world? Also, if you understand the story of the Moorish Science Temple, that in the 1920s, they fought to use religious freedom as a way to affirm their religious identity as a part of Islam. But they continued to be relegated to just being a racial group or a racial entity. And if you want to know more about it, I highly recommend, and I have the book here by Tisa Winger. She wrote the book, Religious Freedom, The Contested History of an American Ideal, because this is a great resource to see how throughout history, African Americans have continued to fight for religious freedom rights and our identity, no matter if it was the Moorish Science Temple, no matter if it was from African spirituality, or even if it was those that identify with the Nation of Islam. But we also have to remember the legislation that has come up as far as LGBTQ rights, that even in that, when you're talking about LGBTQ rights, you're also considering the rights of those that are racial and religious minorities who identify with these groups in the United States. And then I also raise Representative Ilhan Omar, because we know that she has consistently been targeted very publicly primarily because of her religious identity. She is a Somali American woman, but at the same time, I used her image to raise the fact that when you're talking about the separation of church and state, the past administration put the Muslim ban into effect. And so that impacted Muslim majority countries, but also African nations. So when we're talking about racial justice and church state separation, we have to look at history in a very different way from how it's told through the mainstream narrative. And so for that, I wanted to remind us that, the First Amendment says that, reads that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so there is not a government sanctioned or state sanctioned religion here in the United States. People need to be reminded that the United States is not a Christian nation and that everyone has the right to practice their religion without discrimination or even dehumanization. And so, but what does that look like when we see policies in the public square that speak very differently to that? And so I suggest that religious freedom is not only just a constitutional, but it's a human right to a person's freedom of conscience and belief, no matter what they choose to believe or not to believe. But it's also about a person's right to freely practice their religion or not without discrimination or government interference. And yet we continue to see this today in the public square. And so I think about this topic because we're talking about racial justice and raising the question, is there religious freedom for all? Because what I see in the public square is a narrative that pushbacks and says, maybe there isn't. When I look at this image of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where the 4 little girls were killed on a Sunday as they prepared for Sunday school, and over 20 people were injured as a result of that. And that was an act that was acted out by people that identify with the Ku Klux Klan, who also identify as Christian individuals. Then also, I think about Indigenous people and how Indigenous people have to continue to fight to preserve their sacred lands. And so, what does it mean when you have certain groups that continue to fight for not only their right to religious freedom, but their right to exist and to be in society? And so even more recently, we know that, or some of you may know or may not know, that the Sikh Gurdwara in Kent in the UK was vandalized with the swastika. Again, when I think about the nuances of this and how religious freedom and racial justice and church-state separation tie into one another, I say, look at the many different situations and who are the people that are most impacted by the policies, by the issues that come up and that play out in the public square. And so I have to talk about the impact. I don't know if anybody saw the movie Get Out. If you haven't seen the movie Get Out, I highly recommend it because it speaks to not only the experiences of Black people in America, but it also speaks to the reality that, as Angela Davis said, that if racism is not addressed, that racism becomes a legal framework. And in many cases, it has become a legal framework that has been used in policies that have come up as it pertains to education. And so I'll highlight that soon. I'm trying to also keep mindful of the chat as well as the time. But it's a legal framework that is used, and again, it comes up in public policies, it comes up in healthcare access, it comes up, as I stated before, in the Muslim ban and immigration. Again, thinking about just the other day, I watched not just a documentary, excuse me, it was a webinar that was hosted by the Haitian Women's Collective, where they were talking about the disparities stories of Haitian women and Haitian children and families at the border. And again, keeping in mind like all the different nuances when we're talking about these different areas of interest in society. I'm also mindful of the great mystic and theologian Howard Thurman, who talked about in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which is a great book for anyone to read, that how African Americans have to live with some level of deception in their lives. And so we have to navigate not just African Americans, but people of color and religious minorities have to navigate life in a way in which ultimately we're trying not to be killed. We're trying not to be targeted for different reasons in society. And so we have to talk about racial justice when we're talking about religious freedom and when we're talking about church state separation. And that even goes to even speaking to racial microaggressions, commonly held practices or beliefs about certain groups, or silencing groups, or discounting their experiences, or even when people say, I don't see color, what do you mean you don't see color? Because I think there's beauty in our diversity, and also even minimizing some of the racial cultural issues or cultural sensitivity issues that people of color and religious minorities experience. And so Chasen in this case is a psychologist. Her name is Rebecca Chasen. I encourage you to do some research on her work as well. One of the things that I wanted to raise in this conversation is looking at this report that came out from the Public Religion Research Institute this year, and talking about how religious liberty, is it a shield or a sword? And so as you can see, some of the key findings from this report is that 88% of Americans agree that the US cannot establish an official religion or favor one religion over the other. Which is great, right? But I have concern for that 11%, because that 11% was probably part of those that showed up on the steps of the Capitol on January 6th. I also want us to look at the fact that, you know, there are 89% of those respondents that agreed that everyone is free to follow their religious beliefs or practices in their personal lives as long as they do not cause harm to others. But I found it very disturbing when I read that 22% of the respondents favor allowing small business owners to refuse to provide products or services to gay or lesbian people because they felt that it would violate their religious beliefs. To this point, in 2019, PRI did a research study, and they did a study and they asked the question about, similar to this, if people felt like they could discriminate against certain groups based on their own religious beliefs. And 15% of the respondents said they felt it was okay to discriminate against African Americans for whatever religious beliefs they hold. That says a lot. But I also want us to also look at the fact that right now in America, I found it very interesting that, you know, there are 72% of white evangelicals that feel as though that religious liberty is being threatened in America. And the reality of it is what is really happening is there is a shift in the narrative and a shift in the dynamics. What we're doing is the work of restoring or making sure that religious freedom is for all. And so in that, there must be some church state separation. This is the PRI poll that I was discussing earlier, so you can see the numbers there. I also thought it was important to bring into this infographic, again, depending on one's perception and their worldview, people view that certain groups are experiencing more discrimination than others. And as you can see, according to Republicans, there are large numbers of Christians and whites that are experiencing discrimination. This is what I would park in the category of Christian nationalism that is happening. Again, we're in this moment of where there is a retelling of the narrative and telling of many narratives in this work of religious freedom. And again, raising the question, whose religious freedom are we talking about? Whose right to exist and to be are we discussing? And this is the last slide that I want to show as far as infographics around PRI's research, is that I found it deeply disturbing, especially after last year when there were lots of protests around not just this country, but around the world to address police brutality and the targeting of African Americans, that on the heels of the events of the summer, that this survey showed that the only group that saw racial inequality as a top critical issue were Black Protestants. And so it raises a lot of questions for me in terms of the work that we're doing in religious freedom spaces, that we're doing on church state issues when it comes to prioritizing racial and religious minority groups. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done. These are some numbers from hate crimes, the hate crime statistics from the FBI. And I appreciate Alice Chan actually put this slide together for a presentation. And we borrowed this information because I think it's important for us to see that, you know, hate crimes, of course, come in many different forms. We see the numbers show here that race are some of the higher numbers, but you have religion and you still have hate crimes based on ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, as well as gender bias. And even within those areas, again, there are intersections where there are people of color and religious minorities who are often targeted. So how do we address racial justice within religious freedom spaces? I want to get us here. Is that first we need to understand what is racial justice. So racial justice is the systemic fair treatment of people of all races. And this results in the equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. It is about everyone's ability to achieve their full potential in life, regardless of race, regardless of their ethnicity, or the community in which they live. And this information, there's a whole glossary that is provided by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where you can learn more about equity and equality. You can learn more about race and racism. So you can have this language in your own vernacular that you use when you're doing justice work in these areas. But I want to highlight that it's about a systemic fair treatment of people of all races. And so again, how do we address racial justice within religious freedom spaces or on church state issues? The first thing I say is examine your bias, right? Examine what you know and what you think you know about people who are like you and people who are also different from you. I also encourage with that you need to engage in dialogue. You need to learn a new narrative. The mainstream narrative is not the experience for everyone. We know that when the story of religious freedom is often told, is told from a very white mainstream narrative, and also from the perspective of white male narrative as well. So with that, we have to acknowledge history. And when I say acknowledge history comprehensively. One of the things that I pointed out in my earlier slide is I talked about, like, look at time periods and what's happening in history. And I think that's the beauty and the brilliance of historians. Also, to his credit, the beauty and the brilliance of of Dr. Gates, who just did the PBS documentary about the Black church, that looked at the history of a people and telling the stories of our experiences and the experiences of our ancestors. So with that, I say that we all should work to gain a deeper understanding of religious and non-religious identities. My colleague Ben Marcus at the Religious Freedom Center does incredible work in looking at the 3Bs framework and trying to seek a better understanding as to why people identify with certain religious groups or non-religious groups. Is it because of the beliefs of that group? Is it because of the behaviors or the practices of that group? Or is it simply about community? And so I think it's important for us to get a better understanding of why people identify the way they do and to ask them the questions about that. But also, I want us to lean into reimagining advocacy and engagement in this space when we're talking about religious freedom and church state issues. It's about being an ally and accomplice for racial and religious minority communities. And so I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like. So, allyship. Allyship is important. Being an ally is basically showing up to be a supportive. It's like being a supportive associate of another group, a group that is often marginalized or mistreated. It's about showing up and being present with that group and walking alongside them. I also say this, and I borrow this from my friend Charles Watson Jr., who says it's not enough to just be an ally, but it's good to be an accomplice. I use the language of saying that an ally can do like double dutch. They can decide whether or not they want to be in and out on an issue. Whereas an accomplice says, I'm listening, I'm here, I'm walking alongside you. And whatever risks come for doing that work, I'm willing to do so. And so we need more allies and then accomplices in doing the work of racial justice and looking at church state issues in a different way. So I'm going to wrap up by saying a little bit about my story. Just as I shared earlier, I said I grew up Pentecostal. I was licensed as a Baptist, but I am from Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, Virginia is in Central Virginia. It is my hometown. My parents still live there. My parents are college sweethearts. The population in Petersburg, Virginia is less than 32,000. The demographics is a predominantly African American city. If you know anything from a historical standpoint, Petersburg is also where the siege took place. And so, do some research on that. The average income for Petersburg, Virginia in 2020 was $36,135, whereas the average for the United States was about $68,000. 22% of the population lives in poverty, and 24%, as you can see, are on Medicare, Medicaid, and 10% on Medicare. And also, as far as education, you have 82% that have a high school diploma or a GED, and only 19% have a bachelor's degree or higher. However, I often tell people after I read this data and statistics that I sit in a place of privilege because I am an African-American woman that has a doctorate, and I have the privilege of living in Arlington, Virginia, where my child is privileged to attend the second highest performing school district in the state of Virginia, where my child wants for nothing. And so what does this look like in terms of church-state separation and racial justice? Is remembering that when you hear conversations about private school vouchers, right? When you think of that, I want you to remember those communities like mine from which I grew up, that are predominantly African American, that could use every single dollar every single dollar of public funds that fund education. I want you to remember that private school vouchers were created in the 1950s and the 60s to defy desegregation orders because white parents and white families didn't want their children going to school with Black kids. I want you to also know that this is very personal to me because my mother was one of a few students who were a part of the first integrated classes that took place in Alexandria, Virginia. So she understands what it's like to receive hand-me-down worn textbooks that were outdated as a part of the separate but equal education system. So I want you to remember what racial justice looks like for me is showing up for as an advocate for public school education, because public schools and the work that we do at Americans United, we're reminded that public schools are for everyone, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, regardless of their gender, or the way in which they navigate and show up in the world based on their abilities or their gender identity. And that public schools have to be accountable to the public, whereas private schools or private religious schools do not. And so what does it mean to talk about racial justice and church-state separation? For me, it looks like remembering my story. It looks like remembering my family. It looks like remembering history and being an advocate for those that that continue to sit on the margins, whether they look like me, whether they believe like me or not. I believe that racial justice work is a responsibility of all of ours. We all have a responsibility to show up and to prioritize religious freedom for everyone. And so I'm honored that I have been able to do some of that work at Americans United, and that I will continue to do so. I'm also grateful that I was able to do that work in the work that I did at the Religious Freedom Center with a book that we published just this year about African Americans and religious freedom. So I say, why does this matter? Because everyone has a story, and we need to listen to everyone's story and their experiences and find ways to practice empathy in our lives. We have to remember that racism continues to show up and impact racial, ethnic, and religious minority groups and impoverished people in America as well, even if they don't recognize it. And that it also shows up in the judicial system, in the ways in which people are treated because they are incarcerated, and the ways in which it shows up in transportation. And so there are many ways in which you can show up as an ally and do this work, remembering that it's not about their story, but is our problem. It's a problem for all of us to take on. And so I'm inspired by the words by Amanda Gorman that she gave during the inauguration, and those final words when she said, "There is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." Nothing changes until people decide that they want to push for change and work together and walk alongside those that are marginalized in this country and in this world. So with that, I offer that you have the opportunity to download the book if you would like to learn more about the African American perspective on this work. And I look forward to answering your questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation. I have a few questions ready to go, so I'm just going to jump right into it. My first question for you is about an article that one of your colleagues at Americans United wrote about voter suppression for the Americans United blog, and I was wondering if you could speak to that as an example of the intersection of church-state separation and racial justice. So how should we understand voter suppression in that context?
Right. So, yes, one of my colleagues recently wrote an essay about voter suppression. And I think it's important for people to recognize that, one, voter suppression continues to happen today. And we know that the fight that we saw down in Georgia was very real for Georgia to turn blue. And as some people said in the spaces in which I navigate, is that that Georgia wasn't blue, right? It's like if you were in a space where voter suppression was real to you, then you may not have had the opportunities, or you were discouraged to take action in the ways in which you could exercise your right to vote. But I would say this: in the many different ways in which people can show up on this issue is to really speak out about it. Like, think back to what I highlighted in the earlier slide about 1965 and the voter suppression rights. First of all, we have to remember that Dr. King and his allies and those that walked alongside him in doing that work had to work tirelessly, and they met several times with Lyndon Johnson. So it wasn't like a one and done. It was an intentional effort to push forward in doing this work. It's important to realize that with voter suppression, that because the article was there was an article that I saw recently that talked about how there's this pushback for even houses of worship being places where people can even go and vote. And so the thing is, if those spaces they're not proselytizing the people, they're being a space where people can go and vote. Like, like the many different ways in which it shows up and the nuanced ways in which people try to repress the vote for certain communities is really real. And I think that's something that this group should pay attention to. And also, I want to raise a person's name in this. Holly Holiday does work around, she has an organization called Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote. I apologize, Holly, if I'm giving the wrong name of it, but it's an organization that she did just that. She rallied around voter suppression and addressing those issues in the public square, especially down in Georgia and around the country. And so there was a major push for that to happen. So there are a lot of ways in which Jews for a Secular Democracy can show up and being allies and doing that work. And so I think about, even although I know this is a secular group, right? I think about Rabbi Heschel, right, and how he showed up as an ally. If we go back to the civil rights movement, or as is also identified in the African American community, the freedom movement, because it was about freedom in many different ways. Is like there weren't just Black people that were involved in that. We needed the support of every community to engage in this work. And the same thing applies to voter suppression today. It applies to immigration. It applies to dealing with mass incarceration. There are many different levels in which people need to engage and should engage on this topic.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from Eileen. It's a broad one. She said, what do you believe is the reason that there's a lack of progress in racial equality in the United States?
That's a great question. One, okay, I will say this. I want to say I'm representing myself today. So these are my views on this. And so I want people to walk away from this saying these are Sabrina Dent's views and not necessarily the views of Americans United, right? So one of the things is that I had a conversation with a friend yesterday, and I said, people are often surprised as far about the slow progress for racial justice in this country. And so we have to look back at history and say that Black and brown people have never really been prioritized in this country nor in the world, unless it was for the benefit of a system of capitalism. So thinking about how it was the free labor of enslaved Africans that, made this country what it is today, right? So when you think about that, That's one thing, right? But the other part of it is the silence of our friends and the silence of our allies. Dr. King said, in one of his quotes that, it will not be the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And so for me, that's what I remember in doing this work. It's the silence of my friends. And so for me personally, I choose to show up for everyone. One of the pieces of legislation that, we're looking at in our organization is the Do No Harm Act. And so not that I want to talk specifically about the Do No Harm Act, which is an important piece of legislation for us to support in terms of, looking at how RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, has been used to discriminate against people based on their many different identities and even in employment practices. But thinking about how I think about my friends Kevin and Joey. I think about, as a biracial, same gender loving couple, how their rights have been violated over time. And so I think about like the silence of our friends, the lack of people wanting to stand up. And then also there's this whole issue about the I want to call it oppression Olympics, right? It's like people want to compete to say what group has experienced more atrocities than other. If you go back to the slide that I showed earlier, when I showed the image of the two communities for that particular slide with the Jewish mothers and children, like and also the lynchings of the remembering those that were lynched in society, like I'm bringing everyone into conversation, into community. And so what happens sometimes is people might say, oh, well, we can address this issue, but this particular thing, it's not really a thing, or when, for example, when the events that happen and on December 12th, I thought it was very significant because when you think about what the Proud Boys did, right? They didn't go to a public library and take down a sign. They specifically went to historic Black churches. And so again, it's about looking at history. People have to stop denying history. People have to stop saying, not my America. This is not the America that I know. Ask any racial and religious minority in this country, and they will tell you, like, this is the America that we know. This is the America that my foreparents have known and that we continue to know, until people that consider themselves to be allies, until people who say that they're doing anti-racist work actually do the work and be willing to take the risks that come with doing the work. And sometimes that unfortunately leads to isolation. And I just think that it's just so important for us. And the thing is, I don't want anyone to be isolated. I don't want anyone to experience what I experience in society as a Black woman in America. But when you see something and you don't say something, that's a problem. And Congressman John Lewis said that, when you see something that is not right, when you see something that is not fair, then you have a moral obligation to do something about it. And when you fail to do so, then that's why we continue to have issues with racial injustice and discrimination. And that's how, enslavement then becomes, Jim Crow, and then it becomes mass incarceration of certain groups.
I want to follow up on something you just said, actually, because I feel like this comes up as a tension point where folks like the ones who are like our members might not really know how to navigate, even with the best intentions, right? So the two communities that you compared, the Holocaust Museum and the lynchings, I think there's a lot of folks who identify see the connection between the kind of bigotry that Jews face from anti-Semitism, and see the connection between that and racism, and how nationalism, white nationalism in particular, harms us both. But I think sometimes drawing that connection can come off as saying that they're obviously not exactly the same experiences, but we can draw those connections. But I think there's always the danger of trying to of coming across as understanding a struggle you don't actually can never fully understand, especially if you are a white Jew. So how can you draw a common cause between, my struggle is your struggle without kind of crossing that line.
Right. For me, it's about affirming the human dignity and worth of every person. Right. And so it's emotional for me to think about this. Right. It was, there are two things I want to share. When I went to the Holocaust Museum, and we walked through, and like I said, I had my child with me, right? I thought about, what did that feel like if somebody tried to take my child from me, right? What did it feel like for enslaved Africans, for those mothers to be separated from their children, right? I think if we come at things from a place of empathy and trying to really understand the human experience, not just based on one's religious or non-religious beliefs, but to say, what does it feel like to be harmed? What does it feel like to have a moral injury? Or can I remember that time when there was a moral injury that was put on me, or that I experienced, that would then allow me to say, I know what that feels like. I don't want you to feel that. And so, two things in my own religious community at a time, when I was a part of the Baptist church, I had an experience where I went back to my home church, which was a Pentecostal church, and someone said to me, in a very, for me, was a very spirited moment, that because I was crying, they whispered in my ear that I needed to come back to God and to get out of the Baptist church. And so for me to have that experience from my own, right? And when I say my own, I mean in terms of, right now I'm a lump Christianities together, although they made it very clear that there was a distinction between Pentecostalism and being Baptist, that I understood and felt the moral injury of that. And that is something that I've carried in my life with me. My friend Sloan Lee taught me this in a very different way. I met Sloan in my 20s. He was a person that didn't have a religious identity. He never talked about God or anything. He talked about aliens, and I thought it was cool because my mom raised us watching Star Trek, so that wasn't foreign to me, right? It was just like, oh, there's a world outside of this, and I'm making a point to this, is that in my connection and experience with Sloan, I valued him as the person that he was, not based on any belief system, but just the fact that he was a human being that existed and that I cared about him and that I loved him as a person. And so, what does it look like for people to do that? To just care about the human being and to remember those stories of suffering that connect to their community, whether it's religious or cultural, to then translate that to the experience of another person. What does that look like? And I also say this. I also remember in 2017 when I participated in the march. There was a march for Black women that converged with another march. The March for Black Lives, and we were marching, and there was a controversy around this, the day in which this event took place. It was scheduled to take place on Yom Kippur, and so, which is a very sacred day of observance for many Jews, and I'm not saying all, right? So for many Jews, and so on this day, as we were marching, there were many who committed to being a part of this. Many Jewish women committed to being a part of this march. Many communities committed to being a part of it. And as we were marching, there was a point in which, as marches happen, they say different chants and everything. And so there was a chant that happened, and they said, Black women matter. And there was a woman on the sidewalk that said, yes, but not on Yom Kippur. And it took everything in my being to continue to walk forward and to remember that I matter every day of the year. And with that, although I had that experience, that experience did not sever my ties nor my relationships to other people that identify as Jewish, nor my concerns for that community. I was like, that was that one particular person. And so apparently she has a lot more growing to do in her atonement. But I would say that for me, it's about remembering those experiences that say, I don't want someone else to experience this. I don't want someone to not be able to love who they love, whether we're talking about the case of the Lovings, right, in the state of Virginia, where they couldn't love one another because they were of different races. And, you know, what did Mr. Loving say to the Supreme Court? He said, I just want you to tell them that I love my wife, right? And so when you think about even the ways in which people want to practice or choose to practice their beliefs, is about showing up for the human being, because they have a right to exist. They have a right to be. They have a right to thrive. And that's what racial justice says, is that I'm going to work towards a system that supports and values every person, no matter where they come from, for their right to live, to exist, and have access to all the rights that every person has in the fullness of their humanity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dent. There are lots of more questions, but we want to be respectful of your time.
I can stay if people have more questions. I'm willing to. If
Okay.
there's another pressing question, I'm willing to stay. Yeah.
Well, then maybe we can do just one more here and then wrap up. I do want to really quickly say that the Jews for Secular Democracy also supports and endorses the Do No Harm Act. So if you scroll up a little bit in the chat, and I'll post it again, you can actually contact your members of Congress through the action alert there and urge them to support the Do No Harm Act. Just to also note that 2 of the lead sponsors of the Do No Harm Act in the House are members of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, including Congressman Steve Cohen. So we have one more question here about, oops, sorry, I just need to scroll up a little bit to find it. The question was about whether there is any, I'm trying to remember it from memory because I can't find it here. 1 second. Oh, here it is. Within segments of the racial justice movement, especially Black church activism, is there an element of mistrust of non-religious people and atheists, even if those people want to be allies and accomplices? And if so, you know, I guess the question is, you know, how to bridge that divide.
Right. I would say I work very hard to try to bridge that divide. I mean, that is a very real and relevant question that was asked. And so I appreciate the person that asked that, because I will not sit here and say like, oh no, everything is rosy and, you know, that things are great. One of the intentional ways in which I have tried to build relationship in the work that I do is with my friendship with Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder of Black Nonbelievers. And so in the work that I've done, and I didn't really speak extensively to this, but the book that I talked about earlier, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities, was birthed out of a 3-year project that focused on the complex politics of race and religion in this country, and to really tell the experiences of African Americans from many different perspectives. And I was very intentional every time we expanded another part of the project, which thanks to the Henry Luce Foundation, we were able to do this work, is that I often raise the question, whose voice is missing from the table? And so in that, I brought in conversation partners like Mandisa Thomas to be featured on our public symposium to really talk about her experience as a Black woman who identifies as a non-believer, and the ways in which we actually walk arm in arm in doing this work. And so I'm grateful to Mandisa, because when we reached out for endorsers for the Do No Harm Act, like, you know, her organization, Black Non-Believers, signed on to it. So I think it's important for people to, again, it goes back to what I said about dialogue, right? Is to engage in dialogue, to ask healthy questions of the other person to get their perspective. And I recognize that there's a lot of work that still has to happen within Black religious spaces, even within the Black community, and understanding the many different Black religious and non-religious identities. But we have to have these conversations, and it starts with one person. It starts with befriending someone and recognizing the humanity of that person. And so for that, I am truly grateful for Mandisa and the many ways in which Black non-believers have brought me into their space. At their 10th anniversary celebration, I was one of the keynote speakers, and then also a part of their legacy series, because it was important for them to see that there are people like me, and I'm not the only one. There are people like me who are allies of non-religious people, that we are fighting for your rights to your freedom of conscience, or the ways in which you see the world, like that we want to walk alongside you in this journey. And so I think it's important that we, again, like engage in dialogue, get a better understanding of religious identities. And I say that very comprehensively, and because that expands across the spectrum, but to really do this work from a place of remembering the people that you've met in your life that have been the characters in the plot of your narrative, even if it was only for a moment, that they changed your world or caused you to have an aha moment, or oh, I never thought about that. Like, to think about doing this work through that lens and that experience of what does it look like to do this work thinking about the most marginalized person in this world. Could that be someone that is a racial or religious minority that might be a part of the LGBTQ community, who also might be non-religious? What does that look like? And so if you do the work with their human dignity in mind, then I feel like it shouldn't be a problem to do this work for everyone.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. I'm Paul. Sarah had to go. She got called away, and she runs a very tight schedule. So I wanted to close out, though, and thank you so much on behalf of Sarah and for the whole Jews for a Secular Democracy initiative and all of our volunteers. This is extremely helpful to hear, and we want to put it into action. And so we look forward to continuing to work with you, and of course, Americans United, which is leading the way on these issues, and hope that we can contribute to it in whatever ways we can. But again, just want to say thank you so much, and really appreciate it.
Paul, thank you. I thank you that you trusted me to be a part of this conversation and to share about the work that we do. And I encourage people to go to au.org. We have an AU Action Network where people can plug in, engage, and reach out to your elected representatives to make sure that they're endorsing the Do No Harm Act and doing what's right through the lens of racial justice and religious freedom for all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care.